It's my absolute pleasure and honor to introduce to this very august gathering out here, Professor Dr. Peter Stokes. He is one of our oldest friends and partner of ABS. Apart from being a very honored and respected member of the Amity Parivar. Professor Peter Stokes is a professor of leadership and professional development in the Leicester Castle Business School, De Montfort University from Leicester, United Kingdom. Previously, he was a professor, faculty-wide deputy dean, acting executive dean, and director of research and knowledge transfer at the University of Chester, United Kingdom. He has taught, researched, published, and reviewed extensively in leading journals in the areas of, among others, management learning and development, human resource management, business ethics, management philosophy, organizational design, organizational behavior, critical management studies, and research methodology. His work has appeared in world-class journals such as Human Resource Management, Organization Studies in Higher Education, Journal of Organizational Change Management, Employee Relations, and Entrepreneurship and Regional Development. He has published books on research methods and critical management studies. He is editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Organization Analysis and serves on a number of international journal boards, including the Euromed Journal of Business. He has been visiting professor and academic advisor in businesses and universities in a number of countries, including France, Holland, Spain, Ireland, Germany, Vietnam, Morocco, Mexico, Hong Kong, China, India, and Dubai. He's fluent in English and Spanish and has a working knowledge of Swedish and some Italian. He has applied his work through national, international knowledge transfer and consultancy projects across a range of business sectors encompassing utilities, construction, publishing, aerospace, diplomatic emergency services, and local government. He currently holds a number of positions on major international bodies, including Vice President, Business Relations and UK Country Director for the Euromed Research Business Institutes, the UK Ambassador for the Association of Academic HR, Organizational Committee of the Research Methodology, British Academy of Management, member of the BSI Human Capital Standards Committee, member of the Steering Committee of the Spiritual Capital Development Company, Institute of Directors, and associate of the MBRF Foundation. And this is my favorite part. He's also led a large number of mountaineering expeditions in the United Kingdom and the European Alps. In his spare time, he enjoys running, hill walking, languages, travel, food, wine culture, and creativity, and above all, his family. Professor Stokes, on behalf of Amity Business School, I warmly welcome you. Thank you so much, sir, for gracing this occasion.
One of the reasons why business and management studies should be very concerned about genocide is that to run a genocide, you actually have to have incredibly high organization and extensive bureaucracy. More than that, you can't run a genocide unless people are complicit and compliant in making it happen. And also, it eliminates resistance. So what we know is that genocide requires collaboration from numerous organizations for it to happen, be it armies, suppliers, intelligence, other services. The civilian population of a country who are not the subject of that genocide might also have to be involved by being complicit and closing their eyes to what's going on around them, as one might argue was the case in Nazi Germany, or indeed any country where genocide happens. So far from genocide being a sort of peripheral extreme activity, which indeed it is in many ways, we see that genocide actually goes to the heart of what society should be and shouldn't be, and what society can be. Next slide, please. So before I go further in this, I just want to make 3 qualifications to this. This is an important subject, but it's also a sensitive subject, and we need to respect that. So while I will be referring from time to time in the talk to the Nazi Holocaust conducted during the Second World War, primarily against the Jews, but also against other populations, I will be referring to genocide more generally that have occurred. We also need to acknowledge that there's no necessary consensus, as in many discussions and topics on academic topics, about genocide, and there are many different views and opposing views. So I'm not trying to offer a one view here. I am trying to be respectful to the many views that might play a part in the discussion. Next slide, please. Secondly, we are going to make analogues or comparisons between what we see happening in human processes and behaviours in genocide and everyday life in organisations. There are parallels there, you know, the way that organisations downsize, the way people get treated and bullied and pathologised, and we know that lots of bad things happen in organisations. We're not saying it's genocide, but what we're saying is by studying both phenomena, we can learn lessons from both and try and do things better. We are acutely mindful of the need to respect the memories and experiences of the survivors of genocide. So we're not trying to claim that the arguments we're making have the same, as we might, to use the expression in the literature, the same hot violence of genocide. But what we can see is analogues. We can see parallels of human behaviour. And really, it's about spotting the thin end of the wedge, spotting the beginning seedlings, the moments of behaviour, and stopping that before it turns into something more serious. That's the project we have. That's the opportunity we have here in everyday organisation and management. And we will suggest that when we go through the discussion, you'll see that it is not only us that suggests that there are profound similarities between what happens between human beings in genocide and organisation and management at times. It's also some of the main writers in the field, such as Primo Levi. Next slide, please. The final point really is to, actually say, can we draw lessons from an examination of genocide in relation to organisation and management? And some historians like Novick and Elie Wiesel would say no, that it's so unique, it only has its own lessons and we should try and learn from it. Others would say, well, we need to be careful of trivialising and taking wild lessons and rash conclusions from looking at something like genocide and extending that to wider human activity. But perhaps the words of Yehuda Bauer in 201 are useful. He said, the warning to humankind is written on the wall. Beware and learn. Learning is crucial here, not only for Jews, but for everyone, children as well as adults. So we have to examine these phenomena, however challenging it is, to learn and make sure they don't happen again. Thank you. On to the presentation. Thank you. Next slide, please. So let's just start. Obviously, whenever we're doing a discussion and we're trying to have a proper discussion on it, the crucial thing, and this is one of the things we're always trying to get students to do, of course, is define your terms. When you use an expression, concept, what do you mean by it, and then stick to it. So here I give you a definition of genocide drawn from Raphael Lemkin, who was the person who coined the phrase genocide. He was a Polish lawyer trying to conduct legal trials against Nazis after the Second World War and get the UN to adopt a definition. And the key thing is it's an attempt, a committed attempt to, with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial or religious group. And this has now been, in modern era, extended to political. So people of a particularly political creed may also be included quite often when we talk about genocide, attempts to eliminate a whole political creed. Next slide, please. So our field, management and organisation studies, really can't stand by and let this phenomena in the world happen. In the past, academics have had a partial interest really in genocide. Yet it is a feature of academics, management and organisation domain. Genocide has to be, it's a mass activity like mass production or mass consumption. It's an attempt to eradicate an entire group of people. And that's usually hundreds of thousands, if not millions. So that needs to be planned, organised, controlled, managed, documented, led. All the things we talk about in organisation and management. And when Yanis Gabriel and I started looking at this in 2005, 2007, what we noticed was there was a huge silence in organisation and management studies. There was no talking about this phenomenon, even though it's so obviously included planning, management, leadership, all the things we talk about, and it involved organisations. So we were concerned about that silence, and that's why we ran the conference stream in Vienna at EGOS, and then went on to write the paper and other activities. Next slide, please. So we know that there have been many genocides in the 20th century, not just the Nazi Holocaust, but Stalin's purges, Mao's Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian genocide, and they've all more or less engaged management practices. Next slide, please. One of the interesting reasons why organisation and management scholars haven't engaged with this phenomenon up to now is because it tended to be seen as an extreme event. And what's really interesting in the last 15 years in organisation and management is that extremes in organisations has become a central topic talked about in organisation management journals. And in fact, the work that's been done on genocide by ourselves and other people has been a strand contributing to that central positioning of seeing extremes as an important event. Of course, other things like the 2008 crash, financial crash, COVID, many other environmental disasters and political disasters have also positioned the idea of extremes right in the centre of organisation and management studies. So when we started writing about this, this was not a well-documented or popular theme. This was not well used. Since that time, as I said, this has now become personally my most cited paper, the one we wrote in Organisation, the journal. Extremes have come to the fore, and now genocide is seen as very much an organisation and management concern that we need to examine. Thank you. On to the next slide, please. So one of the things about genocide is it's not just hot violence. It involves all sorts of human behaviours, and we see these human behaviours in organisation and management. You have to have people who are complicit, who turn a blind eye, the people who help the trains go to the death camps, the people who report their neighbours, the people who don't do anything when people are taken away. Equally, we know that you also get people who do something. You get people who try and resist. people to try and stop. And this is like an organization. People in an organization will see bad things happening, like bullying or bad management or mistreatment of somebody. And some people will speak up and will try to help and alleviate and heal the situation. Whereas other colleagues will turn and not be involved because it doesn't involve them, it's not hurting them, and as long as they don't get involved, they won't be hurt. So we know this is a standard sort of human behaviour that can invariably happen. And therefore, the questions we bump into, the moral questions we bump into in genocide, are not necessarily dissimilar from the moral questions we bump into in the ethics and of our organizational lives when we're dealing with redundancies and destroying environments through resources, exploitation of workers, etc. What we want to do is to look at those managerial and organizational processes and see how what we can learn. As Yehuda Bauer said, what can we learn from looking at both management and organization and genocidal episodes in parallel? Next slide, please. So just a few key sources, and there are thousands of sources to be sought on this. But a really common and important one is the work of Hannah Arendt, the philosopher and journalist. Perhaps her most well-known work is when she was at the trial of Eichmann, the senior Nazi who was captured in South America by Mossad, the Israeli intelligence service, and taken back to Jerusalem. He was living in South America under a different identity, having escaped from Nazi Germany at the end of the war. And he was taken back to Jerusalem for trial. And in a post-war period where many Holocaust victims were still surviving and had made Aliyah to Israel, the new state of Israel at that time, which had been founded in 1948, it was a highly significant moment for Jewish people and the world generally. What she noticed when she was looking at Eichmann sitting in his suit in the accused box in the courtroom in Jerusalem was how ordinary he looked, how everyday he looked. He just looked like another father, like another man. And she coined this phrase called the banality of evil. In other words, don't think evil when it comes to your door looks like the devil or looks like something horrendous or is bad. Quite often, evil will look quite ordinary, but will be a wolf in sheep's clothing. It will look ordinary, but actually it can be. And that's a warning for us in organizations about just being a little bit more perceptive and looking behind initial impressions and being a bit more wise. What she noticed was that it wasn't, the Holocaust didn't happen because of some terrible, terrible monster. It actually happened, and genocide happens because of a series of actions, actions and outcomes that happen completely normal and routine, where one normal and routine step just builds to another normal and routine step, and before you know it, you're in a very extreme position. And you've slipped down that slope of what seemed like perfectly rational, reasonable, normal steps. And before you know it, you're in a very extreme place. So Zygmunt Bauman, who was a sociologist at Leeds, he wrote Modernity and the Holocaust. And he argued that don't think that genocide and things like the Holocaust are extreme events. They are a natural outcome of the 20th century capitalism, modernism, positivism, and the scientific paradigm dominating. It was only a matter of time, he argues, before all these instruments we use for industry, agriculture, medicine were turned to some horrific end like genocide. And indeed, that's what the Nazis did. At the beginning of the war, they were quite amateurish, they were quite disorganized, it was not very good. By the end of the war, they had a systematic process by which they were murdering hundreds of thousands of Jews a year. So they became very industrialized, so it was a gradual process of innovation, if you want to use that term, that they were able to become so efficient at killing people. So we can see these parallels, and this was all organization and management theory that they were engaged in, and so it's central to our cause. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as I say, Bauman says it's the outcome. The genocide instigated by the Nazis, he comments, represents the extreme application of a bureaucratic logic. Well, what makes the Holocaust so peculiarly appalling is the way in which it was constructed industrially, with a system of rules, impersonally applied, which made it technically efficient as genocide could be. So what he's saying is, we just use the processes we use to run a factory or to run some other bureaucratic office. And okay, there was the violent hot point of the moment of killing people in the death camps, but all the steps leading up to that, of shipping them, processing them, documenting them, putting them into ghettos, corralling them, administrating them, etc. That was just a management and organization process which was made to look every day. And in fact, the Nazis were also very, very good at pretending that it was just a benign process. So, for example, you were not being sent to a death camp, you were being relocated. You were not being sent to a gas chamber, you were going for a shower. So there was lots of deception and misrepresentation in this process as well, all within a bureaucratic process. Next slide, please. So it's this point really that Anna Harant makes about the banality of evil. And if we look at another academic author, Stuart Clegg over in Australia with his colleagues Kornberger and Pitzes, they asked this question writing about the Cambodian genocide, and he writes, at the heart of the moral question is the interpretation of power and ethics. Why do ordinary people in organizations do morally bad things when asked to do though? What aspects of an organization make this unquestioning obedience feasible? And we know that when we look at Enron, when we look at other corporate disasters, when we look at environmental disasters, when we look at Union Carbide at Bhopal in India, when we look at any disaster that's happened in relation to business and management, we know quite often it was a result of people being gone down a gradual series of steps, being asked to do morally wrong things, but they chose to do it for reasons of resistance and compliance. So what we know is the same mechanisms and processes that could lead to a genocide also happen for other events in organizations. Why? Because they're grounded in human behavior. Next slide, please. So we'll go to next slide, if that's okay, please. Okay, let's just talk about some acts of resistance and how we can challenge some of this. Well, you know, there was actually, for example, in the Holocaust, a lot of Jewish resistance. There were large groups of Jewish partisans in the Soviet Union operating covertly, fighting German forces there. The Warsaw Ghetto was an uprising in Poland as the Russians advanced on the Third Reich. And there was an uprising for quite a number of days, led by the Jewish community there, where they fought the SS and finally lost, but they did resist. And we do know that there were riots in death camps where people rebelled, etc. But there was also resistance of other people, for example, people hiding Jews or hiding people or trying to save people. And if we think about the Rwandan genocide, the film that was the book that was turned into a film, Hotel Rwanda, shows the hotel owner there trying to protect and save a whole range of people who are threatened by genocidal acts in the hotel with the UN. So we know whether we're talking about Anne Frank in Amsterdam, etc. And very interestingly, I don't know if you saw on the news recently, they think this very week, they think they've actually now identified the person who informed on the Frank family that led to them being taken off, except for the father, and being murdered at Auschwitz and other death camps. The story goes on. So we do know that, for example, when we look at the Holocaust, and we do know, for example, that things like the Jewish councils in the occupied territories, the Judenrat, and in the ghettos, were actually used as part of the machinery of destruction. So they would put leaders of the Jewish community to organize affairs in the ghetto, but those people would have to report to the controlling Nazi regime. So, you know, it was tragic that the Nazis actually used bureaucratically Jewish leaders to organize their own people for their own purposes of destruction. And they didn't really have much choice in that. Although, of course, in terms of resistance, one might argue there is always a choice, and we will come on to that shortly. Next slide, please. So, examples of resistance. Here are some more examples. You know, we might help people with food. We might have an underground printing press. We might give up our food to save someone else, etc. We might actually take up hot violence and fight the opposing oppressive force trying to eradicate us. A large part of resistance was not actually about trying to kill the person who's killing you. It was about trying to maintain some moral dignity for your own identity to not be eradicated. We see this in organisation and management as well, where people who are being bullied or are being made redundant, etc., you know, there's an attempt for them to retain some moral dignity or some attempt to maintain some face in the face of the challenges they're facing. Next slide, please. So in terms of resistance, there's a very famous poem from a vicar, a priest, who was in Germany, a Protestant priest, and he said that resistance was important at all times, because if you don't resist, it's a thin end of a wedge. And so what he said was, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Catholics, Germany being a Protestant country in the main at that time. And I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. And then they came for me. And by that time, no one was left to speak up. And that's the thing about resistance, that if you don't resist, gradually the resistance is eroded, eradicated. We see this also in novels such as George Orwell's 1984, where Winston, the protagonist, actually does try to resist by doing things he shouldn't be doing against the party, the dominant party that it controls the state he's living in. And he has a relationship with Julia, which is not allowed by the party. But ultimately, he is caught, he is made to comply, he is complicit, and he's turned into. And gradually, the party eradicate all resistance. And we saw all this also in places like the Soviet Union under Stalin, etc., where all resistance, if you don't resist, gradually all resistance is eradicated. So it's the argument we shouldn't resist because we'll get hurt, or I don't want to resist because I'm comfortable, really isn't a very safe place to start building your argument from, whether you're talking about fighting organizational politics or whether you're talking about fighting something more serious like a genocide. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Professor Stokes, is it visible or you want the next one?
Next one, please. Is it sticking? Ah, okay. So one of the concepts I want to talk to you about is a concept. Oh, okay. Are we okay?
Just adjusting it. Just adjusting it. Just give me a second.
If you go from current slide, it will come up. Yeah. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk to you about the concept of othering, because this is really important in organizations. And othering, and it happens in families, it happens in the street, it happens in offices, it happens in schools. Othering happens everywhere. And this is an idea talked about by philosophers like Emmanuel Levinas, the French philosopher, and also Rorty and people. And what othering is, it's a process that we find in lots of discourses, but it's essentially casting a group into the role of the other, being outside of one's own identity. In other words, it's the them and us. So basically, a classic example would be, oh, those lot over there, or all those people from the other town, or those people from the town down the road, or all those people from that district, or all the people who have that skin color. Any comment like that is an othering comment. And what it does, it diminishes them. It's an attempt, actually, when you do that, to make them lesser than you in some form of dignity, love, pride, nobility, to remove them. It's almost like moving them from being an equal fellow human being to you. Somehow they've got an illness, they're not quite right, they're pathologized. And so we see this a lot in organizations. A classic example when people are being made redundant, etc., is to refer to people as dead wood. We're getting rid of the dead wood. And all these expressions really are attempts to make it easier to talk about what you're doing, that somehow you're justified in doing it because they've got some impediment, some problem, some issue. Next slide, please. So what it also does is go back one, please. It denies them voice. So the fact that we cast them into this situation means they cannot have a voice of their own. So as François Lyotard, the postmodernist, says, the abjection suffered in the camps, the death camps, horribly illustrates the threat of exclusion when we exclude people, which weighs on all interlocution. On the school playground, the child to whom others say, "We are not playing with you," experiences the same unspeakable suffering. He or she suffers a wrong equivalent on its own scale to a crime against humanity. So that cruelty that people do to each other, say, "Oh no, you can't be in our club, you can't be that." This is a process of othering. And it's what it is. Othering is a step in a whole series of stages, which we're going to look at now. Next slide, please. So Gregory Stanton was a lawyer who came out with the 8 stages of genocide. And what he said is, what happens is we need to stop genocide early on, or processes that involve genocidal behavior, even in organizations when we're doing things like redundancy. So classifying people through othering. So first we categorize the population. So a whole department might be called, "Oh, that load of people down there, they're dead wood, you know, they're rubbish, they're bad, you know, we need to get rid of those people. They're just not any good at all." And so they start to become pathologized, they start to become less. Then they get symbolized. So you might stick a label on them. In the case of the Jews, it was a yellow star. In the case of a department, they might get put into a particular category of review or some other thing. As a result of that, they start to become dehumanized. They're a little bit not as valid as us. They're a little bit not as organized. And then what we do is we put, Then we put organisation around this process, and we gradually, increasingly polarize these people into a corner. At the end stages, we prepare to get rid of them. Yeah, and then we do get rid of them. And the worst stage really in genocide, really at the end, is to deny it ever happened. So all genocides end with an attempted denial. And even today, in relation to the Holocaust, there are the Holocaust deniers. There are people who say the Holocaust didn't happen. In some countries in the world, Holocaust denial is a crime. And if you deny the Holocaust, the authorities will take action against you. France, the UK are examples of that, Germany, and other countries too. So we can see that what we've got here is a series of slippery slope, a set of steps that we can see happening. Next slide, please. So when we look at parallels, etc., we can see that this logic can get applied to organizations in the way we conduct things like redundancies or bully people, or etc. And it usually survives because people are prepared to tell little white lies or turn a blind eye to the things that are going on, rather than saying, hang on a minute, you know, that's inappropriate language, or we, you know, in the early stages of those stages, we really shouldn't be othering those other people. Can we talk about them as colleagues? And we know there's a business reason we've got to get involved in this discussion, but just actually have it, not as a dehumanizing process, and one that takes away people's dignity and their livelihood and their homes and their mortgages and damages their families, but actually conducts it with more dignity. You might say that organizations do this, but actually, I think if you talk to a lot of people who've been through processes of being made redundant in modern organizations, it's a fairly humiliating and horrible process for them. Next slide, please. Yeah, I think we've talked about that. Next slide, please. The thing also to say about othering is, you know, there are consequences that as a result of all this stress and that, people have heart attacks, they have strokes, they get ill through stress and etc. So it's not like this othering behavior that happens in management and organization actually has no consequences. We know that stress and ill health and well-being are massive issues in modern organizations, and many people are off ill. So this is not an unimportant issue that we should be thinking about. Next slide, please. Okay. Next slide. I think we've made those points. Thank you. Okay. One of the difficulties is when all these processes are happening in organizations is that anybody seen as resistant is problematic. One of the things I always find fascinating still reading in most change management books or books on change management is the way they treat and discuss resistance to the plan. Also, it's very common when you look at a director or a manager of a company who meets someone who resists their plan, who offers a counterpoint, who offers it. How many times have you seen in organizations where someone raises a negative or a point that challenges an idea that's been put forward, that their career is jeopardized, that they have problems, they become a problem, etc. It's almost like we really don't like resistance. We have a real difficulty with resistance, and sympathizers just become neutrals. So we create this polar thing. And what happens to people who resist our plans in organizations is quite often they become othered, they become pathologized, etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to talk about an idea here that happens as well. And it's another idea where I find people hide in organizations. And it's an idea from Primo Levi in his book, The Drowned and the Saved. Which is, Primo Levi, if you don't know Primo Levi, please can I recommend two of his books, and you might want all of his books, If This Is a Man and The Drowned and the Saved. Both books are about his time as an inmate at Auschwitz. Primo Levi was an Italian Jew. He fought with the partisans against the Germans in the Second World War. He was captured. He was sent to Auschwitz because he was a Jew. But because he was a chemist, he was useful for the Nazis. So they put him in a particular part of the camp where he was used for industrial processes. And he managed to survive the war. But one might argue that he lived with a great guilt that he survived. And he often wondered, really, if by being a chemist, he had othered other people who had died in his place. But Primo Levi talked about this thing he noticed in the camps called the grey zone. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So Primo Levi points this out, and he says about the camps that you really shouldn't think that the Nazi camps, etc., are an exception or an extreme. He said, and don't think that it's good people versus bad people. He said, only a schematic rhetoric can claim that the space, the grey zone, is empty. It never is. He said, when you get a situation like an extreme, be it in an organization or wherever, it's studied with obscene and pathetic figures. Sometimes they carry both qualities simultaneously, trying to serve their own needs. And he also goes on to say that if you want to know the human species, if you want to know how to defend our souls when a similar test should once more loom before us, or even if you just want to understand what takes place as a process, go to any large industrial factory. They have to remember that he grew up in Turin, so that's where Fiat was. And what he was saying was, you know, look, and he also worked in a paint factory after the war. And he basically said, look, the processes I saw happening between human beings in the death camps to survive, to resist, to other, etc., they happen in everyday life in organizations. This was what Primo Levi was arguing. I cannot commend to you Primo Levi's writings enough. If I may say, if you haven't read Primo Levi already, but if you read Primo Levi, If This Is a Man and The Drowned and the Saved, it may well change much of your view on life. It's incredibly powerful writing and totally relevant to the 21st century and your life you're living today. Next slide, please. So what we mustn't pretend is that there aren't choices. Whenever we're confronted in an organization with difficulties, with the slippery slope of the 8 stages of othering, etc., we have a choice to be quiet or to resist actively. By being quiet, are we colluding and actually supporting the bad things that are happening? As Edmund Burke, the Irish political commentator in the Napoleonic era, said, all that it takes for bad things to happen is that good people do and say nothing. Is that silence, that complicity, which is really important. So the bottom line is we always have a choice. As Jean-Paul Sartre, the French existentialist, would say, to pretend you do not have a choice in life at any time, no matter what the circumstances, is mauvaise foi, bad faith. You're pretending, you're kidding yourself. It might be a choice between a rock and a hard place. It might be an impossible choice. Human beings always have choices. When they say, I didn't have a choice, it's a lie. Next slide, please. So Viktor Frankl shows us this very clearly. Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist who went to Auschwitz, and after the war, he wrote a theory called logotherapy, which was about his experiences, which was a positively oriented therapy to help people get through extreme experiences. And he wrote, we who lived in the concentration camps can remember the men and women who walked through the huts, comforting others. giving away their last piece of bread. They may well have been few in number, let's not pretend, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a person but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And there were always choices to make. Every day, every hour offered the opportunity to make a decision which determined whether or not you would become the plaything of circumstance, and by that, renouncing your freedom and dignity, and to become moulded into the form of the typical inmate. And the question for us is, how often do we get moulded into the typical inmate in our organisations? How often do we allow that to happen, just to have a quiet life and not make choices when we see things that shouldn't be happening? Next slide, please. And there are many lessons, not just from Judeo-Christian traditions, but from all the world's religions. But here's some from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Evil begets evil. And as Rabbi Hillel reminds us, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? In other words, when am I actually going to take action? When am I going to care? Next slide, please. So as we've pointed out, it's all about small steps to abhorrent acts. And I coined this in a different way in my 2012 paper on micro moments. Well, what I point out is in organizations, micro moments are really important. But what you find is that a lot of managers ignore micro moments, thinking they can get away with little indiscretions, little white lies, little things that don't matter, just to make their day go easily. But what I argue in this paper is that micro moments, bad micro moments that you commit, never go unnoticed. Someone clocks them, someone sees them. And gradually, if you do that, every time you do that, you damage your trust, you damage the confidence of people in you. So my argument in this paper is there are no free lunches for managers or people, anyone really. Every micro moment counts in your day, and micro moments build up the macro. So gradually, a manager constantly doing bad micro moments in an organization and taking risks with people and not telling people quite the truth or gossiping about people or whatever, their reputation will gradually implode and they will not be able to operate in the firm effectively anymore because nobody will trust them. And they'll be othered gradually by their own actions. They will be othered. Next slide, please. So we've talked about genocide and extremes and othering and the individual. Let's look at organizations and the corporation. Well, there's an awful lot of direct evidence of organizations being involved in genocidal episodes. Perhaps one of the most embarrassing was IBM, the realization that, in fact, IBM was centrally involved in the Holocaust. IBM Accounting and Machines Division was supplying the Third Reich with all the counting machines used in the death camps for administration purposes. And they were doing it during the Second World War through their Swiss subsidiary operation. While American forces were fighting the Nazis, IBM was doing business with the Third Reich. And this is in Black's book, and this is documented. We find organizations quite often very closely aligned to genocidal episodes. Next slide, please. Shell in Nigeria had a very questionable close relationship with the military regime. And the military regime executed an awful lot of people from the Ogoni tribe who were in the oil-rich areas resisting oil exploitation. In 2009, Shell agreed to pay, without accepting liability, a large sum of money to settle a legal action brought by the Ogoni tribe. corporations, as I repeat, are often very close to genocide acts. Next slide, please. So a summary of what we've talked about. We've talked about extremes, and that extremes are not now exceptional. We see extremes every day in our life, and we are living this in the COVID crisis as we speak. They live alongside banality and what looks like everyday and ordinariness. They live right alongside. We need to be mindful of processes of silencing people and othering people. What is our role in that? Are we ever complicit in those processes in organizations? Don't think that evil is a monster coming along with a big baddie mansion, a big bullying monster. Evil can have a smile on its face and can seem like kindness sometimes, but it's not genuine. It's trying to do bad things. Remember that the whole process that we learn from genocide is it's a slippery slope. It doesn't break out one day. It involves a whole process of progressively pathologizing a group of people and then eliminating them from the organization. There are grey zones where pathetic figures live. Don't think it's all goodies and baddies. Don't think the people who are the camp guards are all bad and all the people inside the camp. Everybody's in that zone looking for privilege. And that's what happens in organizations. People make bad micro moments. Why? Because by doing it, they think they'll get some little advantage, some little privilege in the organization, or it will protect them. So people do things first. Next slide, please. So we've talked about a lot of ideas, and I've tried to take the concept of genocide, which wasn't talked about 15 to 20 years ago in relation to organisation management, and now is a central part of consideration of organisation and management. And I've tried to show parallels and analogues between that and the extreme events which have now, and the extreme literature, which also is now central to organisation and management. I've also tried to show how the processes we observe in those phenomena, horrific phenomena, operate really at a micro level, individual level in our everyday lives, and what we should be watchful for in our everyday lives as we try to proceed and live a good life. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions and comments, please.
Professor Stokes, as always, completely enthralled with your presentation. I'm going to go with this new word that I have learned today of othering, because so many times in the organization we kind of, okay, that is somebody else, and I'm sure everybody's interpreting that word in their own minds. Professor Stokes, before I go forward, I must introduce to you that we have some greats of the HR and the organizational behavior joining us for this presentation. So may I start with, in no particular order, Professor Dr. Jaya Yadav. She's the head of department for HR and organizational behavior. Professor Dr. Taranjeet Duggal, again a stalwart academician, as well as head of a whole lot of things. Professor Dr. Vijit Chaturvedi, again a chairperson of the coming big conference. And of course, Professor Dr. Vinamra Jain, he's from the marketing department. So lots of very great academic greats also have joined us for the presentation. I'm sure all of us have gained, and we had more than 120, 150 attendees at any point, despite our first year examinations being scheduled. So any comments from our esteemed faculty members?
Let me quickly thank Professor Stokes. This is Vinamra Jain. I think I really enjoyed your lecture, pretty offbeat to what we are usually used to, and something very a different perspective in terms of management. So, you know, pretty thought-provoking, and I think I'm going to sleep over what you said and, you know, absorb the deliberations. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. And just to say a comment, I mean, I'm happy to send If anybody contacts me directly, I'm happy to send you a copy of the paper. That's fine. That was published in Organisation, which is a 3-star journal in 2010, I think. But you can probably access that anyway. You probably have access to databases anyway. Stokes and Gabriel, Yanis Gabriel. By the way, just while I'm talking, I don't know if you've ever bumped into, Yanis is retired now, like me, he's getting a bit older. But Yanis Gabriel's work is, I think Yanis is probably one of the finest minds I ever had the pleasure to meet in my life. I can only commend Yanis Gabriel's work to you, Professor Yanis Gabriel's work to you. He's a fantastic original thinker, and I do recommend you reading his work on all sorts of subjects, which are fascinating.
And we have Dr. Karen also saying something. She's joined us from University of Winchester. Dr. Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Illuminating presentation in which I've learned so much, and what's been made a great impression is you've clearly articulated the dark side of organisational life, and something that we can all, in our individual remit, when we're thinking about education and students moving into their careers, how to be alert to what's happening, and how to have the confidence to make a stand, speak out, and hopefully, if one finds oneself in such an organisation, to have the resilience and the strength to be able to do so. And so one of the cases that I talk about with my students that you referred to at the beginning is North China and the crimes against humanity for the Muslim people in North China. And you have complicit organisations such as Volkswagen, who quite openly really deny any responsibility, and they talk about it as a supply chain issue. We're monitoring it, we're reporting it. If we found something, we'd act against it, but they're able to continue. So what's your view on how to tackle resistance when taking on big organisational machines?
Thank you, Karen. I think, interestingly, we know that's tough, and we know it's even been documented in films like by Hollywood, like Erin Brockovich.
Yes.
Was a film that was made many moons ago where a woman took on a big corporation, and we see all these things where that one where the newspaper took on the Catholic Church in America, and so on. So it's always tough. I think taking on a big organisation, because they've got resources, they're politically connected, they're linked to government and politicians, like issues of employment, etc. But I think there's an interesting thing there. So I think it's a tough time, taking on any corporation as a small group of individuals. However, my personal view is I'm currently writing a number of papers on generations, millennials, X's, alphas, this thought about new generations coming through. And I genuinely believe, that in the next 5 to 7 years, the workplace will be dominated by millennials and Zeds and alphas, who actually are just radically thinking differently. So I actually think corporations are going to have a really tough time in the future, because I think these new generations are just not going to accept and what they'll do is they'll vote with their product feet. They just won't buy products. They'll put them on a list of undesirable companies. And I think companies, what we've seen really in the last 20 years has been, despite great progress in corporate social responsibility, despite great progress in environmental connecting, circular economy, all these ideas, I think there's still been a lot of greenwash going on, and we're still in a transition period to embed it more centrally. Some companies have done it much better than others, but most companies are still built on the 20th century capitalist shareholder serving model that Friedman prized so much. And we all know that if profits go soft in most corporations in the second or third quarter, And guess what flies out the window? All the lovely to have stuff like corporate social responsibility, all the stuff, the training budget, the connected, the society, the community connected stuff. So that's changing, I think. That's changing radically for a whole number of pressures and reasons, not least resource limitation in the world. Companies are having to change because they can't run as business as usual. But I also think the new generations coming through, actually, I feel quite hopeful that they will demand a higher ethic than was the norm in the 20th century. And as André Malraux, the French politician, soldier and writer, said, he believed that the 21st century will be spiritual or it will not be. And I think the new generations coming through are demanding that, really. I mean, many of us have children or have people who have children or relatives who have children. I have two children who are 25 and 23. I mean, they're a small case study to draw on here as an illustrative example, but let's go for it. My goodness me, that if they think somebody is not authentic, consistent, ethical, if they think a company isn't that, they've gone from their phone. That company gets blocked from their phone instantly, and they won't have anything to do with it. Very different world emerging. So I think we're still rooted to it. Finish off, Karen, thank you for your question. It was a great question, thank you. To finish off, I think we're still a bit rooted in the 20th century battle and the way we fight corporations, like the Volkswagen case you indicated. I see it changing fast. Interestingly, I had a conversation about a major Southeast Asian electronics company recently with a research agency. They wanted me to comment on something. And that's the point I made, that these companies need to change radically to fit in with the new generation. So that's
the final response to that, micro moments, and an amazing micro moments you're creating in lectures such as this that we can all carry away with us and be part of the resistance. Thank you.
Thank you. Tragically, Google pinched my micro moments idea, but there we go. So I'm very wary of using micro moments too extensively now, and I think I'm going to have to rephrase it because Google seemed to have written. They use it for a different reason, but I just don't want Google's lawyers flying after me.
Request our respected dean to make the closing remarks, and then I'll take the formal thank you.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Anupama. Dr. Stokes, I was totally mesmerized by the, your words of wisdom, and there were number of points where you forced all of us to think and explore. There were number of issues where definitely you have raised very valuable points, and I am very sure that all of us must be pondering upon that how to take care of all these issues. I will not be taking much of the time. Dr. Anupama, I think we had time till 3:45 only for Dr. Stokes. But one thing which I must say that Dr. Anupama, we should, if not very frequently, but definitely quite often, we should be requesting Dr. Stokes to, in addition to the international lecture series, in case if he agrees, then especially for the areas where he is keen interest, we can ask him to deliver a lecture for our postgraduate students also, or even if research scholars where research scholars of similar interest. That would be good, because I really feel, and the only thought which came to my mind was why we have invited him so late for the lecture.
Sir, two things. First, he is also a very honored and respected member of our family. He's the honorary professor with Amity Business School.
That is fine. That all we know. That's what I'm saying. That we
have. Delighted to be. Thank you for that honor.
So this is definitely. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Despite of being a member of the family, we have invited him so late.
No, so, sir. In the beginning,
others should not be taking. I mean, other students should not be given an advantage of, because a lecture like this should have been should have been, attended by at least 400-500 students, because we are online. So we should be giving the, in any case, we are now online. We are having YouTube versions of these lectures also. So we should be putting the permission of Professor.
And if you wish to, if you would like us to rerun, for example, this lecture or the organizational ambidexterity or any other topic which you think would be valuable for whichever community you I'd be happy to do it again. I even repeat the lecture. That's really not a difficulty. We can make a date. And if you think that there's a larger community of, you mentioned 400 scholars you have in mind, or 400 students, I'm delighted to run exactly the same session again. That's not a problem at all.
And in the beginning of the year, we had, thrown the calendar open, and Professor Stokes had taken this and everything was good, but our exams got postponed because of the third wave. And that's where the audience, but still we had about 150 today, and we look forward to a lot more of these wonderful lectures. And this is what I told the students and the faculty here, esteemed faculty here, that his lectures will make you think. They will not be your regular run-of-the-mill lectures that you can just go away and forget about it. Every single word that Professor Stokes will say will make you think, and it'll keep going around in your head till the time you work it out for yourself. So with these words, if our respected dean permits, we will close the session. Not before we ask the audience and everybody to please join us for the Mega 7th Global Leadership Research Conference, scheduled for 16th and 18th of February 2022, on the theme Leading into the New Reality, Insights into Actions. Of course, Professor Stokes will be sending you an invite also. And this lecture will be available on YouTube, and because we have an MILS YouTube channel also for MILS, so we'll be putting it up and we'll be sharing it with everybody. With your permission, can we close the session, sir?
Thank you so very much, Stokes.
Thank you, Professor Stokes.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Yes, you too. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, sir, for joining us.